a question years in the making. For years, their friendship had been one of Hollywood's most talked-about enigmas. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, two stars whose connection went far beyond the screen. They shared something that couldn't be staged or scripted. Behind their calm, composed exteriors, both had walked through fire, loss, heartbreak, healing, and rebirth. Yet through it all, they had somehow remained tethered not by contracts or careers, but by something softer, deeper, an unspoken loyalty. The day began quietly, just like most of Keanu's days. He had no desire for the paparazzi, no interest in the Hollywood spotlight. He found peace in simple things, a worn book, a walk in nature, a cup of coffee in his tiny kitchen. But this day was different. This day, the air felt heavier, like it was holding a secret, because today he was going to do something he had rehearsed in his head for years. He was going to ask Sandra Bullock to marry him. It wasn't sudden. If anything, it had taken too long. Their story stretched over decades, from Speed to the lake house, to quiet text messages exchanged on birthdays, to inside jokes only they understood. But through all of it, they never crossed that line. Not when they were young and reckless, not when they were older and wiser. Always dancing close to something greater but never daring to grasp it. Until now. Sandra had been in New Orleans filming a small indie project. She'd called Keanu a week ago to check in, a casual, friendly call. But her voice had trembled a little more than usual. She was tired, worn out by the fame, by the silence of hotel rooms, by the weight of pretending everything was fine. Keanu had heard it, not in what she said, but in what she didn't. He booked a flight the next day. He arrived without warning, just like he always did, understated, thoughtful, unexpected. It was late evening when he knocked on her door, holding 2 coffees from the same cafe they used to sneak off to in Ella. Sandra opened the door in sweats, hair undone, eyes wide in disbelief. "Keanu." He smiled, "Thought you could use some coffee." She blinked back a wave of emotion. "You flew here for coffee." He nodded, "And for you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with years of love, grief, comfort, admiration, everything unsaid. They sat on the balcony under the soft hum of cicadas and distant jazz from the French Quarter. And for hours they talked, about nothing, about everything. Childhood, fame, loss, her father's death, his sister's illness, her kids, his solitude. And when the night grew too quiet, Sandra whispered, "Sometimes I feel like I've lived 1,000 lives, but none of them were mine." Keanu looked at her for a long time. And in that moment, he knew no movie, no role, no red carpet had ever brought him as much clarity as she just had. The next morning, he called a friend who worked at a local antique shop. "I need a ring," he said quietly, "but not just any ring, something real." By noon, he had it. But even then, he wasn't sure how to do it. Not because he didn't love her. He did, fiercely. But because he didn't want to ruin what they already had. Because sometimes you can love someone so much that you're afraid of breaking the very thing that holds you together. He carried the ring in his jacket for 2 days. They took a walk down Royal Street that evening. Tourists bustled, musicians played, but for them the world felt muted, like a bubble had formed around just the two of them. She told him about her son's new drawing obsession. He told her about a poem he'd been writing. And then they paused in front of an old bookstore, the same one she had dragged him into 10 years ago. She smiled, remembering, "You hated that place." "I didn't hate it," he said, eyes twinkling. "I just hated how much you made me spend on old poetry books." They laughed. Then he grew quiet. There in the fading amber glow of the setting sun, with the air warm and still and full of unspoken things, Keanu turned toward her. He didn't kneel. He didn't prepare a speech. He simply took her hand, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, she thought she misheard him. Her heart thudded. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from shock, from understanding. Because deep down, she'd always known this day would come. She just never knew when. But what happened next, that changed everything. Sandra stepped back, heart racing. She looked at him, the man who had stood by her in silence for decades, who had never asked for anything, who had never needed to prove his love because it was in every quiet gesture, every protective glance, every shared memory. And her answer wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't need to be. She walked toward him, took his hands, and rested her forehead gently against his. And then, with her voice cracking and eyes closed, she whispered, "Yes." But it wasn't just a yes to the proposal. It was a yes to a lifetime of vulnerability. A yes to healing. A yes to the love they had both quietly protected for years. But little did they know, that simple moment would trigger a media storm they never imagined. A chain reaction of old wounds, public scrutiny, and personal reckonings. Because the world wasn't ready to watch their friendship evolve into something deeper. And not everyone would celebrate their union. But one thing was certain. The question had been asked, and the answer changed everything. The world finds out, and nothing is ever the same. It started with one photo. Not even a clear one, slightly grainy, taken from a phone across the street, but unmistakable. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves standing outside a dimly lit New Orleans bookstore, their foreheads pressed together, her hands cradling his face, the intimacy undeniable. In that single captured frame, something ancient and sacred seemed to glow between them. The internet did what it always does, it exploded. Within hours, the photo was circulating on fan pages, then tabloids, then major media outlets. Speculation turned into certainty. "Keanu and Sandra, is it finally love?" screamed the headlines. Bloggers rushed to resurrect old interviews, piecing together the timeline of their connection like forensic scientists of celebrity romance. Comment sections lit up with theories and memories, while millions of fans, many who had silently hoped for this union since the 90s, flooded social media with joy, disbelief, and longing. But inside Sandra's modest New Orleans apartment, where the shutters were drawn against the glare of the outside world, she and Keanu sat in stillness, fingers intertwined, hearts colliding under the weight of this new reality. The proposal had been theirs alone, raw, gentle, sacred, but now the world had taken a bite of it. And with fame came distortion. Keanu, always allergic to attention, stared quietly at the laptop as the article headlines multiplied. Sandra watched him, reading his thoughts before he spoke. "I didn't want this to be public," he murmured, voice low and thoughtful. "Not like this. It was ours." "I know," she whispered, reaching across to rest her palm on his knee. "But maybe it's okay. Maybe this time we don't run." The truth was they had both spent most of their lives running, not from people but from vulnerability, from opening the door too wide, from giving the world something it could break. And now here they were, no longer young enough to care about perfection, but still fragile enough to be terrified of exposure. But the proposal had been real. The love was real. And if the world wanted to talk, let them. They had something more important, each other. But reality has a way of creeping in, especially when you're famous. The next morning, Sandra's agent called, her voice laced with carefully measured concern. "Sweetheart, the networks are requesting statements, interviews, clarification. They want to know if it's true. They're offering primetime slots." Sandra sighed. "Tell them I'm not available." "But Sandy, this is a PR dream." "It's not a dream, it's my life," she cut in firmly. "And it's not for sale." Keanu, in his calm way, said nothing. But she knew he agreed. That was one of the 1,000 things she loved about him, the silence that spoke louder than speeches. He didn't need validation. He didn't crave the lights. He was a man who had built a fortress out of authenticity, and she had learned slowly to do the same. But the media frenzy didn't stop. It intensified. Talk shows speculated. Late-night hosts made jokes. Old flame rumors resurfaced. Even fans, well-meaning and emotional, began to flood their shared spaces with questions and wishes and assumptions. And suddenly something that had once been purely intimate was now public currency. Sandra's publicist, meanwhile, called every hour. "Please, just one interview. Control the narrative before someone else does." But neither Keanu nor Sandra cared for narratives anymore. They were no longer characters in a Hollywood plot. They were real people who had waited too long to love each other fully. They didn't want to explain. They wanted to live. Still, the pressure mounted. Then came the twist they never expected. A journalist from a well-known entertainment magazine published a feature titled "The Tragedy Beneath Keanu and Sandra's Engagement." The article, deeply invasive, speculative, and cruel, resurfaced painful moments from both of their pasts. It questioned Keanu's mental health, referenced Sandra's past heartbreaks, and suggested that their engagement was nothing more than a coping mechanism, a reactionary bond formed by mutual trauma. Sandra read it first, her chest tightening with every paragraph. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. When Keanu arrived an hour later, she was on the floor of the living room, knees pulled to her chest, the article open beside her. She didn't cry, not then. She simply looked up and said, "They think we're broken." He sat down beside her, took the tablet, and scrolled in silence. Then he exhaled slowly. "We are," he said softly, "but we're healing, and that's what scares them." She stared at him, heart aching. "I'm so tired of being someone people dissect." "Then let's stop letting them," he said, his eyes steady. "We decide how our story goes from here, not them." That night, they made a decision. They weren't going to do a press tour. They weren't going to stage a People magazine exclusive. They weren't going to give in to the narrative that their love needed to be packaged and sold. Instead, they would host a quiet dinner, just the two of them and a few close friends. No headlines, no photographers, just truth. Sandra pulled out a bottle of wine that had been sitting in her kitchen for nearly 6 years. "I was saving this for something big." Keanu smiled. "This feels big." They toasted under candlelight, music playing low in the background, their hands brushing now and then across the table, lingering just a second longer than necessary. They laughed about old movies, about the absurdity of their fame, about how much better real life felt than scripted scenes. And then, with plates still half full and hearts completely overflowing, Sandra reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny box. Keanu froze. "What's that?" She smiled mischievously. "Something I picked up this afternoon." Inside was a ring. But not for him, for her. "I want to marry you," she said, voice strong and clear. "Not because I'm afraid to lose you, but because I finally know I don't have to lose myself to love someone." Keanu's throat tightened. For years, he had watched her rebuild herself. After loss, betrayal, grief, she had become something indestructible. And now, here she was, offering not her brokenness, but her wholeness. It was the most courageous thing he had ever witnessed. He took the ring gently and slipped it onto her finger. "Then let's do this, on our terms." The next day, Sandra's publicist sent a message asking, "So what should I tell the press?" Sandra typed back only 4 words. "Tell them we're happy." And for once, just once, the truth didn't need a spotlight. But happiness doesn't always shield you from the storms. As word spread about their decision to avoid publicity, Hollywood began to whisper louder. Studios grew wary, brands grew nervous. Agents questioned their judgment. It was as if choosing love over fame had made them dangerous, non-compliant, disruptive. And then, just as things were beginning to settle, a letter arrived. One that neither of them could have anticipated. And it was from someone who claimed to know a secret about their past. A secret that could unravel everything. A letter from the past, and the secret that shook them both. The envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. No return address. Just their names, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, written in careful, slanted handwriting, the kind that looked too precise to be casual. The paper was thick, expensive. It wasn't a fan letter, that much was clear. Sandra held it up, her fingers damp from the storm, brows furrowed with suspicion. She hesitated. Keanu, sitting on the kitchen stool sipping his espresso, looked up from the morning paper. "Everything okay?" "There's something strange about this," she murmured, slicing the seal gently with a knife. As the paper unfolded, the air between them shifted. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct, the deep internal knowing that this letter would not bring something light. Sandra began to read. The first line made her blink. "You don't know me, but I know both of you. And what I'm about to say will change the way you see everything, especially each other." Her fingers tightened. In 1994, during the filming of Speed, something happened. Something that was buried. I was there, I saw it. And I've kept it for nearly 3 decades. But now that you're getting married, I think it's time you both knew. Sandra stopped reading. Her chest had gone still. Keanu stood up, gently taking the letter from her hands, scanning its contents with that same calm intensity he reserved for things that mattered. His brows drew together slowly, not in panic, in memory. "I remember the day they're talking about," he finally said. "You do," her voice was barely a whisper. He nodded, placing the letter on the counter, but not finishing it, not yet. "Someone got hurt, a crew member. There was confusion, rumors, but it wasn't our fault." "But," she asked, almost afraid to hear more. "But I always felt like something didn't add up. Like someone made a decision behind the scenes, covered something up." He looked up at her then, his eyes soft, full of years. "You were just starting your career, Sandra. They protected your image. They didn't want scandal. I was expendable." "No," she said, shaking her head. "That can't be. We were both so young, naive. If something happened back then and it was hidden, I want the truth. I can't build a future with you on top of a lie." Keanu nodded solemnly. Then we find out what happened together. What followed wasn't glamorous. No red carpets, no stylists, just two people now in their 50s digging into a truth buried under decades of industry secrecy. They contacted old crew members, pulled archived reports, called lawyers, spoke to stunt coordinators, medics, extras, and even janitors who had worked behind the scenes on that fateful summer set. And slowly, the truth began to emerge. The man injured that day, an assistant camera grip named Daniel Cortez, had fallen from a lighting scaffold during a reset between takes. The fall shattered his leg and left him unable to return to work for years. The accident had been quietly buried under legal agreements and hush money. Both Sandra and Keanu had been kept in the dark, told it was minor, that he'd recovered, that insurance had covered everything. But it hadn't. Daniel had disappeared into obscurity, lost his job, lost his home. His family moved away. No lawsuit, no scandal, because he'd been paid to vanish. And now, after all these years, it seemed someone connected to him, a friend, a relative, maybe even Daniel himself, was reminding them of what Hollywood tried to erase. They found him, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He declined interviews for years, never spoke publicly. But when Keanu called, identifying himself, the line went silent for so long that Keanu thought he'd been hung up on. Then came the gravelly voice. "It's been 30 years, man, why now?" Keanu's voice was calm, steady. "Because I owe you something I didn't know I owed, and because I'm about to marry someone I love and I want to do it without ghosts." There was another pause, then a sigh. "Then come, but don't come with cameras, don't come with lawyers, just come like a man." The drive was long. Sandra didn't speak much. She stared out the window, her mind bouncing between fear, guilt, and confusion. "What if he hates us?" she finally said. "Then we listen," Keanu replied, "and we don't run." They pulled into the dusty gravel driveway just past sundown. A small porch light flickered near a rusted screen door, and there he was, Daniel Cortez, older, a cane at his side, lines on his face carved deep by time and pain, but his eyes, those eyes, still held fire. Keanu stepped out first. No entourage, no polished shoes, just jeans, boots, and that quiet gravity he always carried. He extended his hand. Daniel looked at it, then shook it. Inside, the conversation was raw. He didn't blame them, not personally. "You were kids," he said. "Famous kids. Everyone was so scared of bad press they shoved me aside, gave me hush money and told me to start over. But it wasn't about the money, it was about dignity. No one even said sorry." Sandra swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, I didn't know, but now I do, and I won't pretend it didn't happen." Daniel looked at her, eyes wet now. "That means more than you think." Keanu reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the table. "What's that?" Daniel asked. "Something more than sorry. A donation, to help you rebuild what they took. Not because we're trying to fix the past, but because we can't walk into our future pretending it didn't happen." Daniel stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then, with trembling hands, he pushed it back toward Keanu. "I don't want money. I want to know that someone in this industry still has a heart. And tonight, I do." That night, as they drove back under a canopy of desert stars, Sandra turned to Keanu and whispered, "I've spent my whole life thinking closure came from silence, from moving on. But it doesn't. It comes from facing the wound and choosing to heal." Keanu glanced over, one hand still on the wheel, the other reaching for hers. "Then we're healing together." They pulled into a roadside diner somewhere near the Arizona border, tired but light-hearted. No one recognized them, just two travelers with history in their eyes and hope in their laughter. As they sipped lukewarm coffee and shared a slice of pie, Sandra leaned forward and said, "We're going to tell the truth, all of it, to the press. Not for damage control, but because people deserve to know that love, like healing, starts with truth." Keanu smiled, proud of her, in awe of the woman who once ran from everything and now faced it head-on. "Then let's do it." Back in LA, the industry buzzed with confusion as a statement went out the next day. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock have learned of a painful event during the filming of Speed that was kept from them at the time. They are taking responsibility now, not because they were at fault, but because silence was. They stand with Daniel Cortez and everyone who has been hurt and unheard in this industry. The response was overwhelming, not just from fans, but from hundreds of workers across the entertainment world. Cameramen, assistants, set designers, drivers, people who had stories of their own and finally felt seen. But even as this wave of truth began to clear the fog of the past, something darker was brewing beneath. Because not everyone wanted their wedding to happen. And someone from Sandra's past, someone who still held resentment, was about to step into the spotlight. Not to celebrate, but to destroy. The shadow from her past and the storm they didn't see coming. The days that followed were filled with a calm neither Keanu nor Sandra expected. After decades of carrying silent guilt and invisible questions, the truth had finally cracked the surface. For once, the headlines were gentle, not sensational, not cruel, just human. The world seemed to exhale with them, a kind of collective sigh as if their courage had given others permission to forgive themselves too. They were finally preparing to do what neither of them had ever dared, plan a wedding not to impress but to heal, a ceremony built not on glamour but on grace. They wanted it small, intimate, somewhere far from flashing cameras and judgmental whispers. Sandra suggested Big Sur, the cliffs, the redwoods, the scent of salt and pine all tangled into one untamed symphony. Keanu agreed instantly. They would invite only 20 people. No press, no producers, no stylists, no assistants. Just truth held by nature. And yet, as they made those quiet plans, unaware of the storm building behind them, a message was being written not in love, but in bitterness. Not in healing, but in revenge. A man named Jeremy Hatcher, a name barely mentioned in interviews, sat alone in a Manhattan apartment surrounded by old scripts, unopened letters, and fading resentment. Jeremy had once been someone, a screenwriter with a sharp pen and a sharper temper. He had loved Sandra once, fiercely, destructively. But she had left him quietly years ago when his jealousy had curdled into emotional cruelty. There had been no abuse, no public fights, just the slow corrosion of respect. He had never recovered. He had watched from afar as she grew, as she healed, as she found love in someone quiet, steady, someone like Keanu. And with each headline, each fan tribute, each photo of them walking hand in hand, something inside Jeremy twisted. He opened an old email folder titled simply, Sandra 2003. It contained scanned copies of letters, photographs, private notes. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, but enough, he believed, to taint the image of the woman he believed had wronged him. He didn't care if it was petty. He only cared that it would hurt. And he had a platform. A podcast, a blog, an audience hungry for nostalgia mixed with scandal. He began to write. The first episode dropped on a Sunday morning. Titled The Sandra Bullock You Don't Know, it opened with soft piano music, then Jeremy's voice, low and calm. Everyone loves a love story, but not all love stories are clean. Not all heroines are as golden-hearted as the movies make them out to be. I once loved Sandra Bullock, and I knew a version of her that the world has forgotten. The episode was filled with anecdotes, stories of arguments, claims that Sandra had used relationships for PR value, hints that her engagement to Keanu was more about relevance than romance. He didn't make direct accusations, he was too clever for that, but he cast shadows, just enough to make people squint at the light. By Monday, the story was trending. By Tuesday, Keanu's publicist called him, voice tight. We've seen this before. These stories spread like wildfire if you don't address them. Keanu replied the way he always did. What matters is the truth, not the noise. But the noise got louder. Fans were divided. Some defended Sandra fiercely, others hesitated. Doubt crept in not because they believed Jeremy, but because scandal is seductive. Rumors spread faster than facts, and Sandra, once held in universal admiration, found herself being dissected again. She sat in her garden the next evening, shoulders hunched, phone face down on the table. Keanu knelt beside her. Don't let this rewrite who you are. Tears clung to her lashes. I'm not afraid of my past, Keanu. I'm afraid of how it's being weaponized. I made mistakes. I loved the wrong people. I stayed too long in the wrong places, but I grew. He nodded, brushing her cheek gently. And that's why I love you, not for your perfection, but for your survival. 2 days later, Jeremy announced a live stream. Exclusive recordings, emails, the final part of the Sandra story. Hollywood tensed. Producers, agents, former co-stars, even people who hadn't spoken to Sandra in years began speculating. The industry had always loved her, but love in Hollywood is fragile. No one wants to be caught defending the wrong person when the pitchforks come out. But Sandra, she stayed quiet. Until Keanu walked into their living room holding a flash drive. "I asked a friend who used to work at Jeremy's production team," he said. "He leaked the final episode to me. I wanted to screen it before it dropped." She hesitated and Keanu walked over to the speaker and plugged it in. A recording played. Jeremy's voice again, slower this time, more hesitant. "This is a voicemail Sandra left me in 2003. I didn't play it in the last episodes because, honestly, it hurt too much to hear, but maybe it's time." Then Sandra's voice, younger but still unmistakably hers. "Jeremy, I'm sorry. I wish I had the courage to tell you this in person. I can't be in something that makes me small. I can't be in a love where I have to shrink to be enough. I hope one day you'll see this isn't about you being bad, it's about me needing to be free." The message ended. Silence. Then Jeremy's recorded voice, quieter now. "I thought I'd destroy her by telling these stories, but maybe I destroyed myself by never letting her go." Keanu stopped the audio. Sandra's hands were covering her mouth, her shoulders shook. But not in pain, in release. She hadn't just been attacked, she had been revealed. And the world had heard not scandal, but honesty. The podcast dropped on Friday, but it didn't have the effect Jeremy expected. Instead of outrage, there was empathy. Instead of cancellation, there was catharsis. The public rallied around her not because she was flawless, but because she was real. A woman who had lived, who had erred, who had grown. Keanu's silent support only added to the impact. Their love didn't falter under pressure, it deepened. That weekend, the two of them flew to Big Sur to finalize wedding arrangements. They walked the rocky cliffs where the ocean screamed against the stone and made plans not for a wedding full of spectacle, but for one full of soul. "Promise me," Sandra whispered as they stood facing the Pacific, "that no matter what comes, we protect this. Us, not our names, not our brand, just us." Keanu looked at her like he was seeing the beginning and the end of his life in the same moment. "I promise, with everything I am." They held hands as the waves crashed below them, not to pose, not to perform, but to anchor each other in the storm. But as they returned to their cabin that night, a car was parked near the gate. And a figure stood beside it, tall, poised, unfamiliar. "A woman." She smiled as they approached. "Hello, Keanu," she said softly. "It's been a long time." Sandra looked at him, confusion etched across her face. Keanu's expression shifted. It was the first time she'd ever seen him unsettled. And in that moment she realized, this woman was someone from his past. And she hadn't come to offer congratulations. She had come with her own secret. The woman who knew too much, and the truth that almost tore them apart. The woman stood motionless, her dark coat fluttering lightly in the coastal wind, hair tied back in a neat bun that seemed oddly formal for the rugged backdrop of Big Sur. There was something piercing about her eyes, not threatening, but unshakably certain, like someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. Her gaze wasn't on Sandra. It was fixed solely on Keanu, as if the world around them had momentarily blurred into insignificance. Sandra felt her stomach twist, the kind of instinctive unease that comes not from jealousy, but from the silent alarm of a deep disruption. Keanu froze, not in fear, not in guilt, but in a way that told Sandra this wasn't someone random. He knew this woman, not in passing, not distantly, deeply. "Monica," Keanu said slowly, voice low and guarded. Sandra's breath caught. The name, though unfamiliar to her, hit with the weight of memory in Keanu's tone. Monica stepped forward. "I didn't come to fight or ruin anything, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." Sandra took a measured step forward, shoulders squared. "Who are you?" Monica turned her attention toward her, face calm, almost mournful. "I'm someone who once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with him." Keanu rubbed the back of his neck, visibly struggling. "That was almost 20 years ago." "And yet," Monica replied, "there's something I never told you, something I should have said a long time ago." They moved the conversation inside, though the weight of it made every room feel smaller than it was. The fireplace crackled quietly, casting flickering shadows on the walls as Monica sat with her legs crossed, back straight, hands folded over her lap like a courtroom witness prepared to give testimony. Sandra sat across from her, lips pressed in a tight line, while Keanu remained standing by the window, arms crossed, jaw tense. Monica looked at both of them, then spoke in a tone that was calm but unmistakably final. "I had a child, 18 years ago, a son. His name is Eli." The words didn't land softly. They crashed like a wave across the room, sucking the air out of the space. Keanu's eyes blinked slowly. "What?" "I never told you because you had just lost your sister. You were shattered. You weren't ready to be a father, and I wasn't ready to disrupt your life with another burden. So I left, quietly, moved to Portland. I raised him alone." Sandra stood slowly, every muscle in her body trembling, not in anger, in confusion, heartbreak, betrayal. "You never knew." Keanu's voice was hollow. "No, God, no." "I didn't come here to demand anything," Monica continued. "Eli's turning 18 next week. He asked questions. I gave him the truth. He's been following the news, the engagement, the podcast, everything, and he asked to meet you. But I couldn't just show up with him without warning, so I came first. Alone." The room fell into silence, the kind that doesn't break easily. Keanu sank into a chair, eyes lost in 1,000 fractured memories, recalculating his life. Sandra, meanwhile, walked toward the hallway, gripping the doorway like it might steady the ground beneath her. It wasn't the child that shook her, it was the timing, the intensity, the fact that everything seemed to unravel just as they had started stitching their lives together. Later that night, after Monica had gone, promising no press, no demands, just a promise to let them sit with it, Keanu and Sandra sat on the back porch wrapped in separate blankets, cups of untouched tea resting on the railing. "I don't know how to process this," Keanu finally said. "You don't have to do it alone," Sandra replied, voice soft but steady. "But you do have to decide what this means for you, for him." Keanu turned toward her, eyes wet. "I feel like a fraud. I built this image of who I was, quiet, grounded, untainted by the usual Hollywood chaos. But this changes everything." "No," Sandra said, reaching over to touch his arm. "This doesn't change who you are, it just adds another chapter. It makes you more human, more real." He looked at her, eyes desperate. "What if it's too much?" Sandra's eyes didn't waver. "Then we face too much together." The next day, Keanu reached out to Monica. He didn't wait for the media to catch wind. He didn't call lawyers or image consultants. He called Eli, his son. They agreed to meet at a neutral cafe in Santa Cruz. Sandra didn't go, not because she wasn't supportive, but because she knew this moment had to be just between them. She waited at home, fingers clenched around her phone like it was the only thing keeping her heart from bursting. Keanu sat across from Eli in the corner booth of a quiet seaside cafe. The boy, tall, lean, dark hair, observant eyes, looked like a mirror reflecting back a version of himself he had never seen. They didn't cry. They didn't hug. They just talked about books, about bikes, about favorite movies and songs, about the ache of growing up with unanswered questions. Eli didn't ask for money or fame. He only asked to know the man behind the myth. And Keanu, in the gentlest way possible, began to show him. Days passed, then weeks. Sandra and Keanu postponed the wedding, not because of shame, but because something bigger was unfolding. A family was being reborn. Conversations with Eli turned into visits, visits into dinners, and slowly the shape of their life began to shift. Some tabloids caught wind, of course, but this time the public wasn't cruel. They watched a man step into fatherhood not with arrogance, but with awe. And they watched a woman, Sandra, support him not from obligation, but from a place of pure, open-hearted strength. They began planning the wedding again, not as a reset, but as a rebirth. And this time, they invited Eli. 1 week before the ceremony, the three of them sat on a quiet beach. Keanu, Sandra, and Eli, watching the sun melt into the sea. Sandra turned to the boy, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I'm not trying to replace anyone in your life," she said. "But I want you to know you're not a disruption. You're part of this." Eli smiled, awkward, grateful. "I always thought I'd be watching this kind of story on TV, not living it." Keanu placed an arm around both of them. "This isn't a movie," he said. "This is something better. This is real." But as the waves whispered against the sand, none of them could know that someone else, an entirely different figure, had been watching their story unfold from a distance. Someone from Sandra's childhood. Someone who had stayed silent for too long. And now was ready to step forward. Not with revenge, but with a truth that had been hidden since Sandra was 12 years old. A truth that would not only reshape the wedding, but everything she thought she knew about herself. The wedding, the stranger, and the answer that changed everything again. The wedding was scheduled for a golden Sunday morning in Big Sur. Not a grand ballroom or a luxury resort, but a redwood grove hidden behind a local artist's retreat, where the trees soared like cathedral columns and light filtered in through the canopy like whispered blessings from above. Every decision had been intentional. No lavish flowers, no overpriced champagne, only people who had earned their place with love, loyalty, and time. 20 guests, no photographers, no headlines, just stories carried by the wind, vows folded into the forest air, and a promise between two people who had lived enough lifetimes to know what love costs and what it's worth. Eli stood by Keanu's side. His face held that quiet, unreadable reverence that people often mistook as introversion, the same look Keanu wore when the world overwhelmed him. Sandra, meanwhile, wore no veil. Her hair was down, gently curled, her dress a simple ivory linen that flowed with the breeze instead of fighting it. She carried no bouquet. Just a small photo tucked into her hand, a picture of her late mother. Everything was perfect. Until minutes before the ceremony, a car pulled up along the dirt path, tires crunching softly through the earth. The guests looked up. No one was expected. A woman stepped out, older, mid-70s, her face aged but elegant. A long coat covered her dark green dress, and in her hand she carried nothing but an old leather book. Sandra turned, puzzled. At first, she didn't recognize her. But as the woman approached, slowly, carefully, almost reverently, something clicked in Sandra's mind. She froze. Keanu stepped toward her. "Are you okay?" Sandra nodded, but her voice trembled. That's Lillian." He looked at her unsure. "Who's Lillian?" Sandra's lips parted, the name catching in her throat. "She was my nanny, my caregiver, my mother's best friend, but she disappeared when I was 12. No one told me why." Lillian stopped a few steps away, her eyes moist, her hands trembling around the leather-bound book. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I tried to stay away. I promised your mother I wouldn't interfere unless it was necessary, but today it's necessary." The wedding paused, not in drama but in grace. Keanu, always the protector, stepped in. "Why now? Why today?" Lillian looked at him. "Because today she needs to know the truth. She needs to hear what her mother never had the chance to say." Sandra stepped forward. "What truth?" Lillian opened the book, revealing yellowed pages, handwritten letters, photos. "Before your mother passed, she asked me to keep this. She knew you weren't ready to carry it back then, but I believe you are now." Sandra stared at the book like it was a living thing. She reached out slowly, hesitantly, and took it. Her fingers brushed over the first page, a letter dated March 1985. "My sweet Sandra, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer by your side, but my love never left you." The letter was long, winding, confessional. It spoke of regret, not the kind you write in tabloids, but the kind that seeps into your bones as you get older. Her mother confessed that Sandra's father wasn't the man who had raised her, that in her youth she had fallen in love with someone, an actor, a man of quiet strength who never knew he had fathered a daughter. She never told him. She married someone else, tried to build a different kind of life, but the guilt remained. Sandra read the letter in silence, the world narrowing to those looping cursive lines. Then she reached a name. She gasped. Keanu leaned closer. "What is it?" Her hand shook as she held the letter toward him. "The man she loved, the man she says was my biological father." Keanu's face changed. It was a name he recognized. It was his mentor, a veteran actor, a man Keanu had worked with on one of his earliest films, a man he had called uncle even though they weren't related. And suddenly, the pieces fell into place. Sandra wasn't just the woman he loved. She was connected to his earliest years in the industry. Their paths had almost crossed long before Speed, long before fame, long before heartbreak. Their destinies had been circling each other since they were children, tied by an invisible thread neither of them had ever seen. But the letter revealed more. Her mother had kept the secret because she feared scandal. She feared the industry would devour Sandra if they knew she came from an affair. She wanted to protect her from judgment. And so, the truth had been locked away until now. Sandra closed the book and sat on a nearby bench, the forest spinning gently around her. Keanu knelt in front of her. "Does this change how you feel about us?" She looked at him, tears welling. "It doesn't change how I feel about you. It just makes me realize, my whole life I've been searching for something that felt like home, And it wasn't fame, it wasn't success. It was this. You, even when I didn't understand it, I was always moving toward you. He took her hand. Then let's stop moving and just arrive. She nodded. They resumed the wedding. Not because they needed to, but because now, more than ever, it was the right time. Keanu's vows were quiet, reverent. He didn't talk about destiny, he talked about choice, about choosing each other not despite their scars, but because of them. You've seen the worst of me, he said, and you loved me louder. Sandra's vows were raw. She spoke of healing, of motherhood, of letting go of the need to control everything. You didn't rescue me, she said. You reminded me I didn't need rescuing, just remembering. Eli stood beside them, his hands folded tightly, watching the ceremony not as a spectator, but as a bridge, a symbol of what it meant to inherit both pain and possibility. Lillian stood in the back row, a handkerchief pressed to her lips, finally letting go of the secret she had held for 4 decades. And as they exchanged rings under a canopy of redwood branches, something shifted. Not just in them, but in everyone watching. Because this wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was something more rare. A real beginning. That evening, with the guests gone and the forest dimming into twilight, Sandra and Keanu sat by the fire pit, wrapped in a single blanket, their fingers tracing the outlines of each other's palms. I was so scared of marrying you, Sandra whispered. Why? He asked gently. Because I thought if I finally got it right, I might lose it. That maybe the universe doesn't let people like us have peace. Keanu leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. But maybe the peace was never about what the universe gives. Maybe it's about what we fight to keep. They kissed, not like it was the end of a story, but like it was the beginning of one they'd been brave enough to write with their real names. And as the fire crackled and the stars came out, they whispered the simplest, truest thing 2 broken, beautiful people can ever say to each other. We're home now. The end.